So this is Trish Triumpho again, and I'd like to talk to you for just a few more minutes, and we'll give some examples of good art. And I want to remind you of some of the principles that we talked about in our lecture on composition. So everything we talked about in composition are things that you need to know for this particular assignment. So go back and watch that lecture. Remember the rule of thirds, balance, unity, variety, lighting, repetition. The repetition of shapes, both geometric and organic, can be absolutely incredible for art. So let's look at a few examples here. So here's one, and remember an asymmetrical balance, right? You know, a little symmetry is good, but so this is a nice example of symmetry, but also some asymmetry. So when you look at this photograph, you can see that there's 3 doors, and it seems very symmetrical. But if you notice, each door is a little bit different. So there is a little bit of variety in with this. You know, you've got these repetition of shapes throughout, lots of rectangles. The windows up top, the doors, and even the bricks are rectangles. Whoops. And, well, didn't mean to do that. Let's go back here. Went all the way to the other end of the lecture. So we're going to go back here. So even the bricks are rectangles. So this is a really, really good example. The lighting is not the best, right? This is diffused lighting, so it's not what I would recommend. Remember, the most dramatic lighting is early in the morning or late in the afternoon when the sun is low in the sky, like below 40 degrees in the sky. And then you're going to get some really good dramatic lighting. So this is a good example of some symmetry, but with asymmetry in between. Okay. And this is a nice asymmetrical balance. You have this is not a photograph, but it shows a composition that is really pleasing. You know, you've got these repeated shapes, kind of diamond shapes in the background. They've used some color. The artist has used some color. And you'll notice the rule of thirds. So if you put a rule of third grid on this, you would see that it works with the rule of thirds perfectly. Right? And remember, we talked about eye directors and focal points. Well, the first thing that we see when we look into this one, and let me see if I can darken this up just a little bit here so you can see. The first thing that we normally see when we look at this is the little teeny weeny triangle of milk pouring from the pitcher. It's the brightest thing I'm pointing to it right now. It's the brightest thing in the composition, is that little tiny triangle of milk. And that's a focal point. That gets your eye into the the painting. And then it travels up around the arm, through the head, and back down. It kind of makes this circuit. And the rest of the composition is there, but it's really about this woman. And once again, this also follows the rule of thirds. So if you put a grid on there, you're going to see that that's one of the things that makes it pleasing to the eye. Right? So we talked about, let me put this up. We talked about repetition of shapes, and look at this. This is really nice. Look at the texture that you can see with this old wood and the peeling paint. It's really fantastic. And you'll see that it's a narrow depth of field, so we can tell what the subject is, but we've got this great repetition of shapes all along here. Right? We've got all these great repetition of shapes, and we have the pattern broken right there. So it kind of interrupts the composition. We've got great lines, this great curving line here that brings but because it's a narrow depth of field, it brings your eye back around here. So you end up back here again. So this is a great composition, a very interesting subject. It's something that you might frame and look at over and over again. Right? Whoops, I didn't want to show that. Okay, so here is a photograph that is a kind of an extreme close-up, and I don't know if you can even guess what it is, but back in the day before we had our modern box springs, the mattress springs that went under the mattress were open, and these are open springs for a mattress that would go on top of. So these would be like the springs you would put your mattress on top of. And so this is a close-up of that, and you can see the repetition of shapes. Once again, it's a narrow depth of field. You've got some really dynamic shapes and this kind of curly Q going up, and they're repeated throughout. And look at how nice the lighting is. It's really nice, dramatic lighting. Right? We saw this as an advertisement, I think, when we're looking at our advertising photos, but it really makes a great art photo as well. Look at it is a symmetrical balance, but there's a little bit of asymmetry just because of the plant. But notice how they've isolated the background. Look how nice that looks. It's a fantastic photograph, and the lighting is perfect. Now this is slightly diffused light, so you don't see distinct shadows, but it works for this particular type of a photograph. Right. Here's some repetition of shapes. Notice that diagonal line here. As you're looking here, this diagonal line, it gives it movement, and then you've got these square and rectangular shapes kind of repeated. Really nicely done, and really nice lighting. It's late in the day lighting, so you've got really good lighting on that as well. Here's one that's pretty symmetrical. The lighting is really is good and dramatic. It looks a little spooky, like when the emotion I get when I look at this is kind of maybe a little bit of fear. It's kind of spooks me out. I think you might find a ghost behind that window or something. It's kind of cool. And this is one of those instances where rules are made to be broken. So once in a while, symmetry works. Like when something that's actually symmetrical in a composition can work. Remember we talked about contrast. Well, it's dark against light or light against dark, and that can really help identify what the subject is. So if something that's really dark against a light background, or something really light against a dark background, can make for a very nice contrast on the photograph. Here's another one where you've got dark against light. Right? There's another dark against light, and these are just taken out in the forest, I think, in Santa Cruz. Here's one where the student has done really nice lighting. This is actually a wall, and the student turned this photograph on its side, and it makes a much more dynamic photograph, doesn't it? You really, with those radiating lines coming down in, you see that repetition of shape. The lighting's good. It has a real interesting feel to it. I think this is a great photograph. Here's another one, something as simple as those little metal kind of nails or whatever on the sidewalk to keep people from slipping. The lighting's not the best on this, but it still makes for a really interesting composition, and with a repetition of shape, the asymmetrical balance, and once again, it's working on the rule of thirds, so you'll see the main elements are there. Here's one that uses some motion blur, right? Once again, we've got repetition of shapes. The lights make a really cool repetition of shapes. And it's not quite symmetrical. Once again, it's following the rule of thirds. Right. Here's kind of a spooky one. Remember we talked about reflections. Well, here's one where someone's just taken a photo in their bathroom, and you see this kind of spooky reflection in the mirror. And it's kind of gives you it makes you curious, like, what is that? Where is that? Right? Here's a great repetition of shapes. I think you might enjoy this because even though it's kind of playful, because art can be playful and fun, it doesn't have to be completely serious all the time. So notice they didn't show the kid's eyes. And that's because this isn't about the kid, it's about the shapes and the repetition of shapes. So you've got the spaghetti coming down out of her mouth, and then you've got this fork kind of pointing in from the side. It also has that same kind of shape like the spaghetti pieces, but it's a little bit, more formal looking. And it kind of points your eyes towards the spaghetti, right? They're kind of saying, hey, look, this is what it's about. The spaghetti and the hair even looks similar. So you've got all this repetition of organic in most cases, organic shapes, because the spaghetti is not like a geometric shape, right? But it's repeated with the hair, the spaghetti, and even the tines of the fork poking in from the side, which makes it a really good composition. And once again, it's the rule of thirds. Here's a time exposure where the photographer actually took a slow shutter speed and got a cloud or fog kind of movement at the ocean with some spray, and you've got that rainbow, and it's fantastic. Isn't that great? It really looks cool. Here's one that's a professional. This is not student work. This is a compilation. So this is something where they've kind of layered several photographs in the same photograph. So they've kind of layered the negatives together. And this is kind of interesting. To me, this evokes emotion of fear. The girl seems uncertain. She seems maybe she's lost. There's too many choices, and there's things in the background that look like map coordinates and other little things. It's very interesting. It's a really good photograph. And repetition. Here's one where they've done a lot of photographs together, kind of making a collage. But notice that there's a repetition of shapes. Almost every one of these has a sphere in it. You'll look that each one has a sphere of some sort. So they're repeating over and over again this shape, which is what unifies it. So even though there's a lot of variety in this one, there's also that unification by the repetition of shapes, both rectangular and circular. Right. Here's a really cool underwater one. I'm guessing the violin wasn't worth very much, but that can create really beautiful light. And of course, how the fabric is flowing there. And look at that. They're not showing the person's face or anything. They're just showing this dress and the violin floating in the water. Once again, check it out. Rule of thirds, you guys. It complies. Okay. And you can make some really interesting stuff by, like, this is just someone that took some fabric and stretched it over this guy, and it really has a interesting kind of surreal feel to it, dreamlike quality. Here's another really interesting one. Let's lighten that up just a little bit so you can see it better. There we go. So feel free to go back through these and kind of look at them a little more. So this is what happens when you have a virus in your you have a virus in your computers. You could bring some frogs in to eat those bugs, those viral bugs that get into your computer. Kind of a fun little thing to do there. So let's take a look at the next one here. This is kind of an interesting one. It's a little spooky as well. It's one that I see as being something that I'm not sure that I would necessarily want it hanging on my wall, but it's interesting. There's enough visual interest that it makes me want to look at it over and over again. And so in that case, the photographer has succeeded in making a photograph that has enough visual interest to be sure that we look at it over and over again. There we go. So let's keep going here. Here's a great repetition of shapes. You can see there's the triangle of the tent flap. There's the triangle of the guy's feet. There's the triangle of the rock